As the grandson of Faber's founder, Toby Faber grew up steeped in the company's books and its stories. He was Faber's managing director for 4 years and remains a non-executive director and chairman of sister company Faber Music. He's written 2 celebrated works of nonfiction, Stradivarius and Fabergé's Eggs, and his first novel, Close to the Edge, was published by Muswell Press. In 2019, he lives in London with his wife and 2 daughters. Today, we're going to talk about Faber and Faber. It was the Untold Story.
Still is, yep. Well, except it's been told now. Yes, fair enough.
The Untold Story, now told by Toby Faber. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you, Nigel. Nice to be back.
At the very end of your book, you say, and this comes from a press release, because you've recruited all sorts of people to tell the story. You're stringing it together using their own words, correct?
That's right. It's a more immediate way of telling the story, I think. If you've got the board memos and the diary entries and the letters, and they happen to be written by some really good writers, then actually why not use them rather than try to paraphrase them?
Right. So at the end of that press release, it talks about the company being determined to live up to the hopes and intentions of its founder, Sir Geoffrey Faber. So what were those hopes and intentions?
To be editorially led, I think, is at the heart of it, really. To be a publisher, and in many ways, the sort of publisher that wouldn't have seemed remarkable to my grandfather, just a publisher that in the 20s and 30s was trying to bring out the books that it thought were the best and most interesting and would have a future, but also to balance that, because this was always something my grandfather was concerned with, books of the moment that would help keep the turnover going in that particular year of publication. And in that sense, that's what Faber has always tried to do with more or less success over the years. And I'm pleased to say I think it still succeeds.
Well, judging by the number of Nobel Prize winners you have in your backlist, just since 1990, when you conclude this book, you're still doing the right thing here.
Yes. To a certain extent, of course, success can breed success. So you can have a virtuous circle where, because in particular, obviously, if you think about poetry, going right back to T.S. Eliot, Faber has had a name for publishing poetry, and that in turn has attracted great poets onto the Faber list, which makes it easier for us to continue having a great name publishing poetry. It sheds its own sort of luster on the rest of the list. And you think about our playlist, of course, but then you also think about our fiction list, especially over the last 20 or 30 years. And you can see that starting to be really exciting, and from a literary as well as a commercial point of view.
Yeah, I mean, as much as anything, it's the great voices, the great writers that you have in your stable that serve as a calling card.
Yes, that's right.
It's not that hard to recruit, I don't think. You just say, look who we've got.
It depends who you're talking to. So first of all, in terms of recruiting, of course, you're talking about the people who come to work at Faber. And I think a lot of them do feel that Faber has that history. Sometimes it can be a weight of history, but generally it means that they know we will be a place which tries to publish the best work. And that in turn, of course, helps you attract the best people. And that in turn means we're more likely to publish the best work. I mean, again, it's a virtuous circle. But it's also in terms of recruiting, most obviously our authors. And again, I think there are many authors who like the idea of being published, I mean, going back to the old days, by the House of Eliot. These days, it might be the House of Heaney, or it might be the House of Ishiguro, or whoever else you want to choose. Nevertheless, there's still that sense that they are joining, as you say, a stable, which means something. And the very fact that the Faber brand means something on a book is something that I'm proud of.
Well, it's not a coincidence that it's independent too.
I absolutely agree, and I am a fierce defender of that independence. I say defender; it makes it sound as though people are attacking it, and they're not really. Well, I mean, and my grandfather said this as well. Basically, the moment you're taken over, then fine, you might still have that brand and that colophon, but in the end, that's all it is. Yeah. It is not all the accompanying culture and everything else that goes along with it. And by being an independent company, that is, as you say, part of what makes Faber what it is.
Well, speaking of your grandfather, Geoffrey was a classical scholar who joined the Oxford University Press directly out of university in 1913. Following war service, he was elected a Fellow of All Souls and was made a director of his family brewery. So you guys are in the beer business.
Yeah, a lot more money in brewing than publishing. So I think it was rather to my grandfather's regret at times that he didn't get on well enough with his cousins and was sacked after a couple of years. But obviously, in the end, to the long-term benefit, I think probably of his sanity, quite apart from anything else.
Well, here, and I'm quoting from one of my favorite books by Ian Stevenson, who tragically was taken from us. It's called Bookmakers, British Publishing in the 20th Century. He quotes your grandfather as saying, "I began my business career in a publisher's office, i.e. OUP, but I spent 3 years of it in a far more lucrative form of business. For those 3 years, I was managing a director in a big brewery, but I have never been so bored in my life. So I had the best of all reasons, personal experience, for saying I would rather be making a competence out of books than a fortune elsewhere. To me, at least, books are better."
Well, there you go. He said it very well, hasn't he, already? I'm glad that I hadn't heard that before, so I'm glad it backs up what I just sort of extemporized.
Well, as I say, it sounds to me like it was more of a choice than him getting sacked, but maybe that's just his spin on it.
I think that was probably him putting his spin at the time. I've read his diaries. He goes to a board meeting, and as I can't remember the name of the person, but somebody drops his bomb being that Geoffrey has indeed been sacked.
Okay. Well, if you'll just indulge me here, I just want to read out his publishing credo, if I may.
Please do, yeah.
Conditions have altered. This was written in 1931. Conditions have altered very much since the 19th century. Lending libraries, book societies, newspaper stunts, the enormous increase of published books, the standardization of business methods, these things have taken a lot of the individuality out of the book trade. The old moral earnestness has largely gone, and though there is a far bigger potential reading public than there used to be, it takes no serious interest in books. On the face of things, the conditions for bookselling and for publishing too are about as unpropitious as they could well be. However, we may be about to see an increase of serious interest and real revival of the more solid and important form of bookselling. The principal reason for this is that we are undoubtedly in for a bad time. There is the perception that things are already seriously wrong with the world as a whole and with ourselves in particular, and the consequence will, I think, be that numbers and numbers of people will begin to ask themselves all sorts of questions which only books can answer. And then Ian adds, although he spoke the above in 1931, when the depth of the recession was already clear, Faber's view that serious books could enlighten, shape, warn, and rescue as well as entertain was the guiding principle of his new publishing house from the beginning.
Great, isn't it? And doesn't it resonate so well with where we are now? I'm sure that's why you read it. I used to give speeches where I would read out extracts from things my grandfather had said, and then said that was 70 years ago or whatever it was. It's amazing how so many of the concerns and worries of the book trade, but also, as you say, the hopes come round in cycles, or perhaps basically things never really change, depending on the point of view you want to take.
Yes.
People are always thinking it was better in the past, or always looking forward to the future.
Yeah. Well, one of the things too that's delightful is that Faber published all sorts of, I would almost say, eccentric titles. That's what makes so many of the books on its backlist so utterly charming.
I think probably small-scale poultry keeping is still in print. We have a number of books from those. Those were all, a lot of those titles were taken on by Richard de Lemare. That was part of the so-called muck and mystery list. And then, yes, I mean, just a hugely eclectic list at times. We've definitely focused it down over the years to try to be, well, I suppose, focused on our more obvious strengths on the literary side of things. But in the past, yes, we were absolutely a really general publisher. Anything that took anyone's interest. Any good book.
Yes. And again, as from a collector standpoint, from someone who loves books, here I'm going to hold this up so that, our audience can't see it. But it's got such a fantastic cover on it. It's called Through Wooden Eyes, and the cover's by someone called Francis Gower. And it's all about Jan Bussel's trips around Europe seeking out wooden puppets and puppet masters and puppet theaters. That's just fantastic.
Yeah, it's, I mean, a niche interest. Yes. But I suspect that would have been one of Richard de Lemare's as well. He had an amazingly wide view of interest. And indeed, I mean, that probably would have been, in some sense, part of the art list at Faber, which was a really important part of the firm in the 40s and 50s, which eventually, technology moved on from us, publishing skills moved on from us, and so we had to abandon it by the 1980s.
Yeah. Well, speaking about recruiting, that's one of the key attributes of your grandfather you identify. And one of the obvious early successful recruits was T.S. Eliot.
That's right. My grandfather had this idea that he was going to turn the scientific press, this publisher in which he'd become managing director, basically because of his All Souls connection, as already discussed. He was going to turn it into a more general publisher, and he had the support of his partners, the Guires, in doing that. And he thought that it would be nice for it to have a literary magazine. And it was somebody who he knew through All Souls, although he wasn't a fellow of All Souls, called Charles Whibley, a relatively well-known journalist at the time, who said, well, I already write for a literary magazine called The Criterion. Perhaps you should have a word with its editor. And so they met. Eliot, of course, was editing The Criterion. He and my grandfather met in late 1924 and just got on terribly well. And I think pretty quickly started exchanging letters about what they might do together. My grandfather's interest at the beginning was certainly in The Criterion mainly, but it led to Eliot himself joining the Faber and Guire board. Crucially, of course, bringing his own books with him at the time, which rather annoyed the Hogarth Press, who had previously published him. So on the opening list of Faber and Guire was Eliot's collected poems to 1925. So that in turn gives the firm a character immediately. And Eliot's own presence gives the firm a character. Although you don't see much of it actually in the early years, I think. He's spending a lot of time on the Criterion. Eliot himself, like my grandfather, are all still feeling their way a bit. So it's only really when Faber and Guire becomes Faber and Faber in 1929 that you really see Eliot's own publishing start to take off in terms of the poets he starts bringing onto the list and the other people he starts bringing onto the list. But yes, I'm sure T.S. Eliot, when you met him, must have been an impressive man to meet. And my grandfather was clearly impressed when he met him. But also they got on well personally.
Well, you tell the story of how they're both a bit shy, and I don't know who said it, but they were just sort of shuffling around in an embarrassed little conversation about ballet.
So that's from an exchange of letters in the 1950s. This is another thing about Eliot. When Eliot essentially is volunteering to take a step back and to take a cut in his own salary so that my grandfather can make another appointment, which we could get onto in a mo. But part of that, of course, is they need to formalize that arrangement. So there's a formal exchange of memos between my grandfather and Eliot about that arrangement, but accompanied by this really touching informal exchange as well, when they reminisce about that first meeting, which is lovely. Yes,
it really is. Well, I must say, couple of things, sort of myth-busting things here. First of all, that the British are standoffish and a bit cold and unfeeling. That's one thing I get from the letters that are exchanged by these two particularly, but throughout the book, is that there's real empathy and emotion and concern about each other as human beings in a business.
Well, thank you. You're right, of course. And I mean, it is just a myth. They had been through the fire together, you know, in the sense of, in those early years, in 1925, the Faber and Guire years, it was all quite tough because Faber and the Guires were not getting on.
Yeah.
And Eliot found himself being the middleman between them, trusted by the Guires as a useful middleman, not so much because of his poetry, but because he'd been a banker before, and therefore was thought to have a business brain.
Right.
So, I mean, it had been going on for a long time, and it was a long friendship, formed in business, but absolutely extending into their personal life as well. I mean, as you know, Eliot would join my grandfather's family for a week's holiday every year in the house they owned in Wales. He was my father's godfather. He was a terrific godfather to my father. There are all these different links going on. He got on very well with my grandmother as well. All of that.
Well, I mean, I don't know about you, but my experience in business, any success that I've achieved has been a result of a close friendship. And it seems to me that a big part of the success of this company is friends going through the battles together and experiencing success and failure.
I think that's right. And it is so much easier, well, to deal with failure if you have friends with whom to share it. And frankly, so much easier to have success or to generate success if you have friends that will help you generate it and to celebrate it too. Yeah. Coming back to my grandfather's qualities, and again, I say this in the book, I think he probably himself would not have said, "I am a brilliant publisher." It's hard to look at books on the Faber list now and say, "Oh yeah, those are the ones that he brought onto the list." I mean, you can argue with a few of them. So it was all about him bringing people into the firm and supporting them. So not just Eliot, but also Richard de Lemare, as I've already talked about. Frank Morley was a really crucial person when he arrived in 1929. And then, of course, the next generation coming after the war. Charles Monteith as an editor and Peter de Soto as a sort of managing director for the firm. So he had two really fertile periods. I mean, for two generations, my grandfather was being a really good talent spotter.
Well, getting back to the failures, when you do have difficult times, it sure helps to have someone around who's got a really good sense of humor. This group that that you write about and have them write, they had a lot of fun together, didn't they?
They did have a lot of fun, especially in the 1930s. And you say to help cope with failure. I think 1930s Faber was feeling quite bullish. They'd come through the beginning of the Great Depression. They were clearly making a name for themselves really quickly as a literary publisher. And although they were never generating huge profits, they felt they were on an upward track, and indeed they were. Those are the circumstances under which they would play all these wonderful practical jokes on each other. I only cover a couple of them in the book because they're the ones that you can sort of bring out through the correspondence and things like that. There are others where there's correspondence which, frankly, I still can't work out what on earth they were doing, but clearly they all found it terribly funny at the time.
Well, yeah, in joke, right? Exactly. You had to be there.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things about Faber, in addition to obviously to the literary quality, is the way the books look and feel. And Richard de Lemare, you say, had a big role in that. Maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, Richard de Lemare, I mean, he's a great character in himself, of course. He is the son of the poet Walter de Lemare, had started working in publishing initially for, I think, his uncle's firm, and then he realized that wasn't going to get him anywhere. Another early recruit by my grandfather, who writes to Alcina Guire, his co-shareholder, something along the lines of, "Young de Lemare seems to have a lot of ordinary practical ability, open brackets, the sons of metaphysical poets often do," close brackets, which I think is a wonderful a wonderful aside. And that's what he brings. So he brings the practical ability is immediately expressed really in production and design. And it's really interesting how Richard de Lemare, with no real obvious experience in that area, immediately starts to take a hold of this and start to produce some really interesting things. He also, of course, brings his own contacts, literary contacts that he has through his father and his uncle, most obviously early on Siegfried Sassoon and the firm's first bestseller, Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man. But in terms of the production, he has the idea quite early on, and I'm pretty sure it is his idea, that the firm should do the Ariel poems, which you'll know about well, of course, as an antiquarian bookseller.
No, not a seller. Toby, I'm not a seller, no.
You're not a seller.
I'm
You're
not,
only a buyer.
I'm not smart enough to be a seller.
Sorry. Anyway, these lovely Christmas pamphlets, about half a dozen every Christmas for about half a dozen years, each one the first edition of a poem. For a start, that means probably in the early Faber and Guire years, because they're commissioned poems. Richard de Lemare is commissioning poetry as much as T.S. Eliot, and that's something to think about. So when you see Faber publishing Siegfried Sassoon and Walter de Lemare and all the other poets in the Ariel poems, as well as, of course, as T.S. Eliot himself, in many ways that's being commissioned by Richard de Lemare. And then he also commissions to go alongside them, and they're nice productions in their own right, but he commissions lovely artwork to go with each poem.
Yeah.
McKnight Kauffer classically to go with the Eliot poems, some of the great artists of that era like Ravilius and Nash and Barnett Friedman, for example. In doing that, he is then making contact with some of the great illustrators of the era, who he then goes on to use in cover designs and cover illustrations for Faber books. It was a really good thing to start off doing, and he was able to, it stood him well for the rest of his life. In 1941, you get the appointment of Berthold Volpi, and again, that brings a whole other character to Faber's covers and Faber's designs.
I'm not a professional antiquarian bookseller, but I am a collector, and I do have the first 10 of those Ariel poems. So,
and aren't they lovely things? And they're still so tactile, and so they read wonderfully in the hand. They were a lovely idea.
Yes, and as you say, I think they really sort of established this fact that Faber really was committed to and interested in beautiful production.
Yeah, and you still get people saying that about Faber books today.
Yeah,
that they are nicely produced, and I think that's right. And I mean, this is not just a Faber comment, but I think generally over the last 10, 20 years, standards of book production have gone up.
Yeah,
and that's partly because, of course, the book now has to make sense as an object and not just as a way of reading text. Because if you just want to read text, you can do that on a Kindle or whatever. So by being forced to compete with ebooks, the books as a physical product have improved.
By necessity, yeah.
Yeah.
The last time we met, I know we spent a fair amount of time on the physical Faber books. And in fact, you gave me this beautiful book by Joseph Connolly, 80 Years of Book Cover Design.
Yes.
At Faber and Faber. I assume that's still on sale and available to listeners?
Still on sale and available, I'm pretty sure. Yes, I think so.
It's just such a burst of beautiful.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
And another thing we have a box of Faber postcards, 100 Faber postcards, which are classic covers from the Faber era, which are rather lovely as well.
No, I didn't realize that. So these are postcards that Faber would have sent out to promote various books?
No, they're newly made postcards made from old covers. So some of the famous Faber covers, for example, the first edition cover of Lord of the Flies is one of the postcards in that box of 100.
Excellent. Okay. I've been thinking about putting book covers on T-shirts. How about we get into that?
Well, truth is, we've tried various things like that, and we can never quite make it work. We've got some cushions lying around the office somewhere. I think we've got a deck chair. All of these things we've tried, never quite made them work. But the postcards, there is a demand for. Okay. The problem is that you're using these postcards to write a thank you letter to somebody or something like that. And some of them are fine, the lovely Ambrose Heath covers, Good Food by Ambrose Heath and things like that. Those are perfect for when you're writing a thank you card to somebody. things like The End of the Affair. No, sorry, that's a Graham Greene, but An American Romance and things like that, which are faintly risque pictures of naked women and stuff like that. You think, who am I going to send that to?
Speaking of Barnett Friedman, in the book you juxtapose the first cover of Members of a Fox Hunting Man, right?
Yeah.
And then you re-released it with a Barnett Friedman cover, right?
Well, it's a sequel with the Barnett Friedman cover. So Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man, Faber and Guire, just towards the end in 1928. Memoirs of an Infantry Officer, 1931. We did with an illustrated edition by Barnett Friedman very quickly, well, in 1931. And it's the difference between those. It's kind of as good a visual way of any as seeing the way Faber and Faber were so much more creative than Faber and Guire could be, simply because they had that greater editorial freedom.
Yeah, it's such a contrast, and such, again, another blast of brilliance, a brilliant color, and just exactly. Again, one of Barnett Friedman's real classics.
My understanding has always been that essentially that launched Barnett Friedman's career. He'd done a few Ariel poems for us before, but he hadn't had much. But it was this that really put him on the map.
Yeah,
there's just been that great exhibition, of course, of his work at Pallant House in Chichester.
Yes, I've been trying to track down the curator of that, so listeners can look forward to a bit more of Barnett coming up.
Great, good.
Okay, so moving on to the reasons behind Faber and Faber hanging on, as you say, to its independence. The first reason you cite is luck.
Yeah, I mean, you can't deny the role that luck plays in it. The classic example of luck that sort of everybody quotes is Cats being made into a musical, and that, of course, was in the 1980s. You can go right back to earlier luck. You can go back to, the luck of Richard de Lemare meeting Siegfried Sassoon at his parents' house, and Siegfried Sassoon saying, "I'm thinking of a book about fox hunting. What do you think?" I mean, the truth is, of course, publishers have to make their own luck, and you make your own luck by seeing the opportunities when they arise and grasping them and riding with them. So, yes, luck, but all good publishers have to be lucky, I think. It's like Napoleon said, I don't want to know if he's a good general, I just want to know if he's lucky.
So, well, yes, and as you say, you need to know what you're looking for. You need to know. You need to recognize.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that itself is what is that? That's a gift.
Well, I mean, so coming back to the core of it, it is if you are an editorially led firm, as Faber is, then it means appointing the right editors, doesn't it? That's what it means. And once you've appointed them, trusting their judgment and backing them in their judgment.
Yeah, but how do you know that they've got great taste or great judgment? How do you know?
Well, that's the question. So, I mean, frankly, one of my grandfather's biggest pieces of luck, we've spoken about it in appointing T.S. Eliot. I think you could call that luck that they met, of course. But in the sense, he was an obvious person that was the right person to appoint. Much less obvious a point he was the one my grandfather made in the 1950s of Charles Monteith, whose background was as a barrister, was another fellow of All Souls, who liked books, basically.
Yeah.
Was incurably literary, as he said to my grandfather. Something about my grandfather's eye for a man made him realize that actually he would be a good editor to a point. So you can say how lucky to appoint Charles Monteith, how lucky that Charles Monteith's first acquisition, in fact, I think it was his first acquisition for the firm, was to spot the book that would become Lord of the Flies and rescue it from the slush pile. I mean, it is lucky, but there must have been something there to generate that luck, both in terms of spotting Charles Monteith and him spotting the book. So, yes, you can always ascribe it to luck if you want, but I like to think there's slightly more behind it than that.
You quote one John Sparrow shitting all over Charles Monteith, and that makes John Sparrow look like a bit of a dork.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I believe, to those who know, John Sparrow is quite a distinguished person. He was Warden of All Souls, which, is no mean feat, and certainly a position that at times my grandfather would have dearly loved to have himself. But he and John Sparrow got on quite well, my grandfather John Sparrow. And so he asked John Sparrow's advice. And as you say, John Sparrow was not kind about Charles Monteith, but not to the extent of shaking my grandfather's resolve that Monteith would be the good appointment, and in particular also, of course, T.S. Eliot's resolve that Monteith would be a good appointment, because my grandfather and Eliot very, very much collaborated in that appointment.
Yeah, I just wish I could find it, because it's such a good direct hit at his taste, at exactly what you need. He's saying,
I can probably find it quite quickly. Sparrow has basically said about Monteith, I think he lacks distinction to an almost positive degree. And I probably expressed my surprise that the coarseness of his fibre didn't grate on Tommy's, i.e. Tom Eliot's, great fastidiousness. Anyway, this is what Eliot replies. This is the first thing, is a response to something that Sparrow said earlier on. I'm inclined to take seriously John's remark that Charles has flair rather than taste. So far as my observation went, this may be possible. I am not sure, however, that from the point of view of a firm's solvency, flair is not a more valuable asset than taste. I have a little flair in limited areas, but I have found taste to some extent a handicap. I wonder whether, if John Sparrow knew the publishing world as well as we do, he would be quite so fastidious. He's picking up Sparrow's own words here and putting them in quotes. I mean, he's absolutely right, yes. And how many men are there in the business whom a person of fastidiousness would be wholly unjustified as criticizing for coarseness of fibre? So anyway, he agrees that Charles Monteith is the right person to appoint. And Charles Monteith in the 50s and 60s was just as brilliant an editor for Faber as T.S. Eliot had been in the 20s and 30s, or 30s and 40s. So it was a great appointment.
Isn't that such an interesting point, though? The difference between flair and I'm wondering if that's a euphemism for something. Flair and taste. You need the literary bona fides. You need to know what great work is, but you also need to be able to spot writing that's going to capture the public imagination as well.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think if I had to characterize the difference between them from the point of view of publishing, it's that if you've got good taste, then you'll identify the same good books as everybody else will. But if you've got flair, then you'll find something that nobody else has identified and realize that this could be something really special. That is famously what you'd see Charles Monteith doing with Lord of the Flies, a book that had been rejected by umpteen other publishers before it came to Faber. He had the flair to realize that if you cut out that first chapter and made a few other changes to the book, then you had something really special there.
And this Sparrow is putting down the flair.
This Sparrow does not understand publishing to the extent that my grandfather and T.S. Eliot do. Yes. And therefore they realize that taste alone is not enough.
Yeah. Okay, so we've touched on luck. Next is, and again, we're talking about how Faber hung on to its independence. Another reason is a publishing philosophy that, without ignoring commercial imperatives, has focused on excellence and the long term. The relationship with authors that last for decades and books that enter the literary canon. Faber's backlist has given it the income at the core of its financial stability.
Well, that's right.
Whose books are these, the ones that continue to make money today?
Some of them are the books that Eliot picked. Some of them are the books that Charles Monteith picked. Some of them are the books, getting a bit later, that Robert McCrum picked in the 1980s. Essentially, these days, the core of any backlist for a firm like Faber will be the books that are in some sense set texts. So we'll have an academic or even a school's demand driving readership, so you can count on sales year after year after year. So that's in the playlist and the poetry list, obviously, and in the fiction list at Faber that you get that core sales.
Yeah.
And it's a source of strength, but it can't be the be all and end all. In the end, the core of Faber, in a funny sort of way, has to be about its new publishing, because it's only if you're continuing to publish exciting books, frankly, year after year after year, that you remain relevant as a publisher. If all you can do is fall back on your backlist, then you sort of think, what's the point anymore?
Yeah. And again, throughout the book, you see reference to, this need that's expressed for exactly that sort of new, revitalizing editors to come in. That's what that's what always talking about that.
And you can certainly see times in Faber's history when we didn't have that.
Yeah.
So it was happening in the early 50s, and my grandfather and Eliot were conscious, and that's why they brought in Charles Monteith. And it was happening very obviously in the 1970s, and Robert McCrum arrived at the end of the 70s, and again, helped by money from Katz, of course, led to another revivification of the Faber list. So, but you do need to do that regularly. And the truth is, however good an editor is, they're going to get older. And as they get older, partly they get full in the sense of they've got their stable of writers. They're going to be less likely to be looking for new writers. But also, inevitably, they are not the same generation as the new writers coming through. You have to be conscious always of the need to keep on renewing. And certainly in the past, Faber has been slow about doing that.
Yeah, speaking of personal experience, it's a bit like what you find funny. This young generation, a lot of the stuff that they laugh their heads off at, I just don't get it.
So, it all comes down to recruitment in the end. As a publisher, it's
right.
Recruiting people who are, who are in touch with, who have the flair to be in touch with the zeitgeist of their particular generation.
Yeah. So, again, that's speaking of recruitment and Geoffrey being a superb recruiter.
The other point I make about, I think you might be about to read this, is it didn't matter when Geoffrey died or when he retired, of course, because the firm had never been just about him. So that's, I think, one of the real crucial changes. When you look at the other great imprints who started around the same time as Faber, so many of them were really so focused on their founder that without their founder, they were nothing.
Yeah. Well, actually, I was going to point to a few other people that he'd recruited. I'm fascinated by Mitchell Kennerley, the publisher at
Morley Kennerley.
No. I'm talking
not
about
Frank Morley. Mitchell Kennerley. Sorry, sorry, Morley's father. Is that right?
Yes.
Sorry, yes.
And he's a fascinating character who moved to the States, worked a bit with Knopf, or vice versa, and was a really interesting publisher who sadly committed suicide quite young. But yeah, as I say, I was fascinated to see that his son stayed in the business and played an important role with Faber. Maybe you could talk a bit about him.
Yeah, so he was, a charming, suave young American, as far as I can understand. In some sense, he came to Faber. This is one of as a protege of Frank Morley. So it's easy to confuse. Well, not if you know them, but there's Frank Morley and there's Morley Kennerley.
Yes.
So one using it as a first name, the other as a last name.
Yeah.
So he comes essentially as Frank Morley's assistant in 1933. People used to talk about the excitement of seeing him arrive in his Rolls Royce or Bentley or whatever it was. He clearly had quite a glamorous life. His wife was best friends with Barbara Hutton, so there was all of that going on as well. Yeah, he brought a lot of interesting books of the moment to Faber. I think it's probably fair to say. Again, you probably wouldn't look at many books on the Faber list now and say those were Morley Kennerley's, but he was clearly an important person, and just an important person in terms of being part of the team. Joining in the fun and all of that. My father, who obviously was essentially one generation younger than Morley. Morley was younger than my grandfather, but older than my father. Remembered Morley Kennerley with great affection, actually, as somebody who just was a lovely person to be around. Yeah.
Again, that speaks to having the right mix on the team.
Yes, and Morley Kennerley, I think, for example, in the days before these things were formalized, he, as much as anybody, was in charge of publicity and was presumably quite a good outgoing person to do that.
Yeah. And what about Frank Morley? Where'd he come from?
He was, I think, a Rhodes Scholar. His father was, interestingly, a distinguished mathematician. There are mathematicians who will know about Morley's theorem, which he did a lot of things in geometry and stuff like that. His brother, am I going to get this right? You can probably tell me. Was he editor of the New York Times, or have I misremembered that? There was another brother, Chris Morley, who was a writer.
Yes, who published quite a number of bibliophile type books.
Yep. And so Frank Morley, he tells his own versions of these stories. He was certainly an early fan of Eliot, right back in the day. was involved early on in trying to help keep the Criterion going. He was in London as a representative of the Century Publishing Company, and sort of got to know my grandfather then in the Faber and Guire years. And my grandfather realized that he would be a good person to come and join Faber and Guire, as he initially wanted. And what that meant was, when Faber and Guire became Faber and Faber, and my grandfather had a free hand then to recruit who he wanted, that was the point at which he brought in Frank Morley. In fact, he tried to persuade Morley to buy a small shareholding, to buy a big enough shareholding, so that it would not be Faber and Faber, it would become Faber and Morley, because but that's not what happened. So it was just Faber and Faber, but he did join. He was a really important principal director in the 1930s, in terms of, I think, bringing the commercial nous of somebody with good experience in commercial publishing, which is what he had. And also, in terms of, I've referred to this already, in terms of giving confidence to people like Eliot to follow their instincts. He was also a big instigator of all the jokes. I think if anybody really instigated all the fun and games, it was Frank Morley. And he was absolutely my grandfather's right-hand man in running Faber and Faber in the 1930s. And my grandfather was devastated when he took an offer to go to New York at the end of the 30s, so before the war broke out, to return to New York, essentially to be the anointed successor at Harcourt Brace.
Yeah.
But as my grandfather admitted in his diary, it's the kind of offer that nobody would want to could refuse. So Morley goes back to New York. The one benefit for me from that, in terms of writing my book, is that means that during the war, my grandfather is writing these lovely letters to Frank Morley, all about what's going on at Faber in the war. So I'm able to quote from heavily in the book. And they tried to get him to come back as well at the end of the war and come back to Faber, perhaps be the person anointed to take over from my grandfather, but never quite works out. So although he comes back to England, he doesn't come back to Faber.
Well, look at the differences in the outlook and the economies of those two different the countries. You know, I mean, the United States is just booming and going through a boom, whereas England is like blasted to bits.
Yeah, but Morley does come back. I mean, I think he has family in the UK by then as well, but he's clearly an Anglophile as well. He writes a book actually, and called The Great North Road. So he's writing it immediately post-war. It starts off with him in the city of London, where the first bombs fell, just surveying all this bomb damage around, as he then starts to go on the Great North Road, i.e. the A1, which goes from London to Edinburgh, and sort of survey the country that way.
Does he touch on publishing in that book or not?
I don't think he does in that book, no.
Is there a book that he does that in?
Not that I'm conscious of,
Okay.
but he might well have written articles and stuff like that. He writes, I mean, there's a really nice piece by him. There's a Festschrift for T.S. Eliot, published in 1965, edited by Alan Tate, for which he writes a piece that's really interesting. He wrote a children's book called Some Point of the Compass, but I think it's East South East, about somebody who runs away to sea and joins a whaler and has great adventures. And I loved that as a child. I mean, he is a really versatile man.
Funny, someone just offered me a bunch of, I think it was Christopher Morley books. I turned it down, but I think it was Parnassus on Wheels is one of his books, Christopher Morley. Anyway, getting back onto recruitment then. Yes, you say that you know, the fact that your grandfather was able to bring together this remarkable set of individuals gave the firm some kind of, if not financial, then certainly a type of stability, staying power.
Yes, because it was not dependent on any one person. If your strength comes from you as an institution in some sense, rather than you as an individual, that gives you staying power.
So have we talked enough about Monteith?
Well, I've talked about Golding being his first, famous acquisition, and you just think about all the other people he brought onto the Faber list, and you think, core, really. He goes to see Look Back in Anger at the theatre. He thinks, right, let's try and get this onto the list. He goes to see Waiting for Godot at the theatre. He thinks, let's get Samuel Beckett onto the list. He has been recruited to help bring on new poetry because Eliot feels he needs younger eyes there. He likes the look of this young man, Ted Hughes. We've got this lovely memo where he's saying to Eliot, everybody's very conscious, of course, always with the Faber poetry list, that here it is, it's this sacrosanct thing. You've got to be really careful about who you allow to join this hallowed, this hallowed thing. You look at the people that Eliot brought on in the 1930s, and of course, you haven't heard of half of them, because in the end, he was prepared to take risks with who he brought on, and we only remember now the ones who have been successful. But Monteith early on is affected by that sense of the hallowed temple. So he thinks, for example, perhaps we shouldn't take on this chap Ted Hughes quite yet. Perhaps he's not yet right. What do you think, to T.S. Eliot? And essentially, he suggests to Eliot that perhaps if Eliot agrees, he could write a letter of encouragement to the young Ted Hughes. Eliot says, no, we should take him on now. So there you've got Eliot really having a great eye. So, but Monteith's definitely involved in that. So you've got Hughes, you've got Monteith writing encouraging letters to Philip Larkin, subscribing to his early collection with the Muswell Press, making sure he comes on to Faber, or comes back to Faber, because we published his early novel. Then you've got a week after Eliot dies, Monteith writes to Seamus Heaney, saying, we've seen your poems in the New Statesman, really like them, would love to see more when you've got enough for a collection. He's writing to John McGann, saying, loved an extract we read in this obscure literary magazine that folded after 6 issues, but clearly he'd read it. He and his team, I think you've got to give credit to some of the young people around him too. So people were like Frank Pike and most obviously the current editor of the LRB, Mary K. Wilmers.
It seems to me, again, Faber has got this magic about it that means that anyone who's a decent poet is going to send their stuff in. That's what puts them in such a great position, is they see everything. Now, which ones are the best from what we're getting? Would you say that's...
I think that's right.
You don't have to necessarily reach out because everyone's sending their stuff to them.
True, but that just gives you a problem in terms of, how on earth you sort through it all. There's no right or wrong way. There's no rule about it. Eliot and Monteith always used to suggest to poets that they should make their name in the literary magazines and gradually build up a collection, and at some point they'd be ripe for publishing by Faber. But then you look at somebody like Ted Hughes, and he didn't do that. I mean, so Seamus Heaney, that was absolutely Charles Monteith reaching out to him because he'd seen his poetry published. Seamus always used to say, he got this letter from Russell Square and thought it was like getting a letter from Almighty God. And that's the reaction you want poets to have, of course.
And Heaney recommended Paul Muldoon to Monteith, right?
Well, exactly. So that's the other part of what, if you've got your own talent, your own poets acting as talent spotters for you, then that helps too.
So did Monteith recruit Robert McCrum or not?
Not directly. I mean, he was definitely involved in that recruitment, and he was chairman at the time and clearly welcomed Robert to the firm. But I think the real recruiter of Robert McCrum was Matthew Evans, was the managing director at the time. I give a little bit of credit to my mother.
Yes, Penny. Yes.
My mother, Penny, because she knew Robert because his father and my father were colleagues, and Robert was then a junior at Chateau and Windus. And so she encouraged Robert to apply for the job.
Right.
But it was really, by then Robert was over in New York on some sort of placement with FSG, Farrar Straus Giroux, and Matthew was over in New York, and he and Robert met for this famous drink at the Algonquin. I think it was at the Algonquin. And basically, over the course of that drink, again, I imagine you could say a bit like my grandfather and Eliot, however many years before, they just got on really well and realized that this could work.
Well, yeah, he Evans offered him the job on the spot, apparently.
Yeah, and as Robert says, Evans had clearly also got the nod from Roger Strauss at FSG that Robert was probably the right thing. So he'd done a bit of research as well.
I like the fact that you mentioned that whoever it was at Shadow and Windus said, okay, Faber, you pick up his bill for going to New York.
Yeah. Yeah. That was Robert's reminiscence. That's right. And yeah. And then again, so you see him arriving in the 80s, and obviously they've got the money from Cats. Robert's got a really good eye for good new fiction in particular. And you start to see them having fun in much the same way as they were in the 30s in terms of playing jokes on each other, and all these things all start happening all over again. Or perhaps they never really stopped, but anyway, you really feel there's this sort of, the firm is on a high in the 80s. And you've got Private Eye calling us Faber and all those sorts of things.
Yeah. Actually, another sort of controversial choice, but one that really helped the company survive financially was doing a book on splitting images, was it?
Well, there's a television series which is just started again in the UK, a satirical television series called Spitting Image.
Spitting Image.
Spitting Image, which uses caricature puppets of politicians and other prominent people in satirical sketches. And so, yes, we did a Spitting Image book. I won't try and describe some of its more lurid pages, because they are quite lurid in places, but they're terribly funny. And controversial to the extent that, yes, I quote that letter from a member of staff who was absolutely shocked that we're doing a Not the 9 o'clock news calendar, which is an earlier satirical thing.
Yeah.
And then since quoting that, I've wondered if that letter itself was a joke. And I still don't know, because it almost could be. It could be somebody being very straight-laced, but pretending to be straight-laced.
Yes. But again, the point being, you got to go with the times, what makes immediate sense, and these sort of publications pay the freight for other more serious stuff.
And you should never be too precious about these things, I think. As long as you have the overwhelming view that whatever you publish is good in its own lights, even if it's a different field from what Faber is famous for.
Yeah.
Then I think you won't be undermining the brand.
Yeah, I think that's the key, isn't it? It's the quality within its field is what counts, rather than trying to stick to a certain house style.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's most obvious in many ways in our poetry list, isn't it? We don't publish one type of poetry.
No.
In the 30s, we were famous for being the modernist poetry publisher. Even that didn't mean just one type of poetry. But certainly by now, it's basically poetry that's good. I mean, it's an awfully subjective thing to say, and
yes,
but that's what you try to do without being too prescriptive about what that means.
Right. Now, finally, on the independence front, and basically making money, you point to the fact that Faber made a decision to sort of be vertically integrated by publishing both hardbacks and paperbacks. You point to that as being really crucial.
Absolutely. And I don't think anybody quite realized at the time how crucial it was, but this is with the benefit of hindsight, and you look back at it. And we've talked about how Faber's backlist is what gives it some sort of financial stability. So especially in years when perhaps your front list isn't quite so good, to know you've got that guaranteed turnover from your backlist is really important. That backlist, of course, is all going to be in the form of paperbacks, because that's how they're shelved in the bookshops. That's the form in which books backlist. Yeah. So if you are essentially giving away your backlist by selling it for some short-term profit gain to a specialist paperback publisher, then you are giving up that long-term stability. And you see this most obviously in the way that by the end of the 1980s, Faber was almost the last man standing in terms of publishers in London with any history. Mm-hmm. So all the other great names who hadn't done their own paperbacks, or if they had done them in joint ventures or things with other people. So you can reel off the names, of course, the Jonathan Cates, the Chatto and Winduses, the Hamish Hamiltons, the Bodley Heads. I mean, you really can just go on and on with names, all of which are great names.
They are,
and had really good backlists and still have really good backlists. But those backlists are all mainly, frankly, in Penguin Random House or possibly HarperCollins or whoever it is, Hachette. They are not still with the firms that bought them because those firms have long since been acquired.
That doesn't stop Penguin Random House trying to cash in on the brands, though, of course.
No, it doesn't. And, I'm not here to criticize Penguin Random House because it's clearly a very successful company. But I would say quite definitely that I really think the Faber brand, and we started with this, means something now. And however good a brand and however good the publisher at Hamish Hamilton say is, it just isn't quite the same thing because it's, in the end, just part of a conglomerate.
Well, I think that's the really important point. Faber's independence makes a fundamental difference to how it publishes. So what's that difference?
Well, that difference is basically, it's just in the culture of the firm and in the attitude it brings to what it does. So a culture of the firm which is independent in the sense of people are free to make their own decisions. Clearly my family and the Eliot Foundation these days, we are the shareholders in the firm, but we would never for a moment think of interfering in editorial decisions, and we don't. So there's that sense of standing or falling by your own decisions, standing or falling both in terms of when it comes to an individual book, but also, and I think this is important, in terms of the finances of the firm itself, that the firm has to make sense as a financial entity in order to remain independent. And that means, of course, that forces it to carry on thinking hard about the balance of the list it has each year in terms of that balance between long-term. So it can't just publish airy-fairy nonsense that it thinks might be popular in 50 years' time, because that is no route to success.
I love those kind of books.
Well, yeah, that is as sure a route to irrelevance as a publisher as anything. So you really do have to have that balance. Yeah. And I think, frankly, the financial discipline that comes from maintaining independence is part of what ensures you have that balance.
Yeah, exactly. You've got that imperative, really, that hones your decision-making process.
Yeah. And you've also got everything else. You've got what we've already talked about, the fact that your new authors are joining this backlist, that to readers who know and care about these things, and they're a minority, admittedly, but to those who do know and care about these things, it matters that it's a Faber book. To authors, it most obviously matters. To critics, it matters. I still think probably Faber does really well in getting review space and attention and social media or whatever it is because of what it is as well. Yeah. Also because of, frankly, the books are so good, but that's another matter.
You talked about the Eliot Foundation. First of all, Faber has sort of acted as an agent for Valerie Eliot, and that's how the company has made money off it. So Valerie must have made monstrous money.
All I do is I quote Andrew Lloyd Webber on this, this is about cats, of course. So yes, Faber has generally been an agent for the Eliot estate, and most importantly was an agent for the Eliot estate when Cats became a musical, when T.S. Eliot's poems became a musical. So as Andrew Lloyd Webber says about Cats, it's been a pension fund for all concerned. I'm not going to go into figures, no. But there's no doubt that the money that Faber received as its percentage was really important to the firm, 1980s in particular.
Sure.
It's still not nothing, it's still a sizable sum each year. And so, yes, so that really meant that Valerie obviously received more. And therefore, and this is obviously where I closed the book, but when in 1990, we wanted to make it clear that the firm was not going to be sold, to guarantee that independence.
Yeah.
The best way of doing that was to make it impossible for us, the Faber family, to sell it. And the way we did that was by bringing in Valerie as a co-shareholder. It achieved other things as well. It enabled us to create an employee share ownership scheme at the time. That was one of the reasons at the time, although that's now folded. So now we're back to having these two co-shareholders in the company, exactly equal shareholders, each wanting to keep it independent, each one there in case the other one blinks, although clearly that hasn't been an issue so far. And as I say, in the end, the best way of guaranteeing Faber's independence is for it to carry on being commercially successful as well as successful in the literary sense.
Well, isn't that lovely that blood ownership goes back to Geoffrey and T.S. Eliot?
Yeah, I mean, and that's obviously how I opened the book as well, because in the end, it's that relationship between the two of them that provides the firm with its core, certainly for the first 30 or 40 years, but arguably ever since as well, in terms of the direction that the firm has taken.
Now, that would be a lovely place to end, but I got one more question.
Go on.
You say that Faber's independence is part of what makes it a natural home for some of the world's most significant writers. So how's it do that? How is it natural?
Well, the cop-out answer to that would be ask a writer and they'll tell you. Because I mean, at one level, I know there are writers to whom it really matters that Faber is independent, and who feel that it gives something special to the way they are published and the way they are looked at for being published by Faber. Other than that, I think it comes back to kind of what I was already talking about. It does mean Faber has a culture which is different from that of other publishers, because we combine the history that goes with 90 years of publishing and the backlist that goes with 90 years of publishing, with still, though, the sort of entrepreneurial outlook and fleet-footedness and eagerness to try new things and all that sort of stuff that goes with being independent, it goes with being relatively small. And I think it does make us, I mean, there have been times in the past when this hasn't been true, but I think at the moment it's definitely true. It makes us good publishers, actually.
Yeah.
And writers appreciate that, and to a certain extent, I think readers and other people appreciate that too.
Does anyone know how big Faber is, aside from you and a few others? Like
our accounts are public knowledge. I mean, so turnover goes up and down a little bit, but has been generally increasing over the last few years. It's of the order of £20 million sterling, our turnover. Basically, we are way smaller than all the obvious big ones.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, okay. Yeah, they're in the billions. I recently interviewed Andy Hunter, who's come up with quite a wonderful way, I think, for readers to support independent bookstores.
This is bookshop.org, isn't it?
Bookshop.org. And
yeah.
One of the things that stood out for me in our conversation was that he said that they've written it up in their company papers or whatever it is, that they will never sell to Amazon.
Yeah. Well, I can understand. I mean, that's particularly crucial for them, because they are there to service independent bookstores to whom Amazon isn't, I think it's fair to say, no friend. So absolutely, yes, I can see why they do that.
Well,
so I mean, coming back to, if you're trying to draw a parallel there between Faber and books, so we would not write that into our papers. We would not be that definite, because I think that would be a way of breeding complacency. If you think, basically, Faber will remain independent as long as it remains sense for it to remain independent. That is as far as I can see into the future.
As long as it remains what?
As long as it makes sense for it to remain independent.
And what does that mean?
It does make sense for it to remain independent. There's no advantage that I can see to anybody published by Faber, but more crucially, from this point of view, to its shareholders in trying to stop it being independent, because it is doing so well as an independent company. And if you say it will always remain independent, I don't want to raise any concerns at all, because I think it probably always will remain independent, and I've got no grounds for thinking it won't. But I don't want to say, nor do I want to say that's an absolute guarantee, because it seems to me that way you somehow stop people feeling the need to make profits. And actually, it should feel the need to make profits, because that's part of what keeps it viable. Actually, not just viable, but vital. I do feel I should never guarantee it will remain independent, but I don't want to make anybody think that we have any plans to sell it, because we don't.
No, but I suppose if it's just it's insane amount of money, I suppose that might be part of it.
I think an insane amount of money alone wouldn't do it, actually, in a funny sort of
Yeah.
way. It would have to be that coupled with the fact that we didn't think Faber was viable as an independent company. And actually, we don't see any sign of that at the moment. Quite the reverse. Quite the reverse.
Well, we're lucky. We're lucky to have Faber, and I'm lucky to have been able to talk to you, Toby. Thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you very much, Nigel. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Toby Faber is the grandson of Geoffrey Faber and the chairman and a non-executive director of sister company Faber Music. Thanks again.
Thanks, Nigel.